Hello and welcome to BC Referendum 2018. Are you voting for change on Shaw TV? My name is Laurel Collins, and along with my co-host, Dr. Michael Prince, we are bringing you the information you need in order to make an informed decision in the upcoming referendum on proportional representation. In the studio today, we have our guest, Sonia Furstenau. She is the Member of Parliament, or Member of the Legislative Assembly for the Cowichan Valley. She's also the House Leader and the Deputy Leader for the BC Green Party. Welcome.
Thanks, Laurel. Thank you, Michael. Great to be here.
So, Sonia, your party is going to be campaigning for the yes side in the upcoming referendum. And what exactly are your plans? Why is proportional representation so important to the BC Greens?
You know, it's one of the values that is a long-standing value and principle for Green parties everywhere. And it's important because it's important for the citizens that their voices, when they go to the polls, and their choices actually inform the makeup of the legislature or the parliament. And so currently what we have in BC is a first-past-the-post system where there's two significant problems. One is that approximately 50% of votes cast in BC don't go to elect anybody. And so that means 50% of people at the end of an election feel like my vote didn't count. And this results in cynicism, it results in a lowering of the voter turnout, it results in a feeling of, I can't really have a say in my democracy. And these are very dangerous conditions for democracy. We want people to go to the polls and to feel excited about voting, to feel like knowing their vote will count and it does matter. And so we need to solve that problem. The second problem we need to solve is that in a first-past-the-post system where you have more than two parties, it means that one party can get 100% of the power with just 40% of the popular vote. And we see that over and over and over again. That's pretty much the standard outcome. We just saw it last week in Ontario, where Rob Ford's Progressive Conservatives indeed got 60% of the seats, 100% of the power, with 40% of the popular vote. That leaves 60% of voters feeling like there's a government in power, they have all of the power, and I didn't vote for them, I don't want them. So you actually have the majority of people who did not vote for the party that has all the power. Those two issues really need to be solved in our democracy, and we need to modernize our democracy, and the best way to take those steps is to start with electoral reform and proportional representation.
And we now know that the ballot is going to have two questions, one generally on whether voters want to switch to a proportional system, and the second one outlining three options, dual member proportional, mixed member proportional, and rural-urban proportional representation. Do you have a preference, or is the BC Green Party going to take a position on which one they prefer over the others?
Well, we're firmly in favor of modernizing our electoral system. So yes to the first question is clearly our preference on that. In terms of the three system, there's benefits to all of them, but the parameters for the decision that the Attorney General made to put those three systems on the ballot were that they met the values of the consultation that he had. Over 90,000 people participated in that consultation. And the four key pieces that really emerged out of that consultation was that people wanted a simple system that was easy to understand. They wanted the regional representation, so you have an MLA or even two MLAs. And they wanted no significant increase to the size of the legislature. And there's a fourth one. Oh, proportionality was the fourth one. So they wanted to make sure that the system actually produces proportional results. The three systems that are on the ballot meet all of those criteria, some of them more than others. So the simplest would be mixed member proportional, whereas the proportionality in the other two systems might reach higher levels. For us, it's the great opportunity here, and it's extraordinary. You and I were talking about this. You know, I'm a historian, you're a political scientist. You're a political scientist. This is great. It's like being back at university. Very few citizens in history have been given the opportunity to say what kind of electoral system they want to have their government operate under. And it is an incredibly exciting opportunity, and I think the capacity for citizens to engage in this and to get informed and to make an informed decision, I have no doubt about that, and I'm really excited about it.
Well, you've already touched on a number of values around any kind of voting system, and as you know, as you just said, there's an opportunity for us to kind of go back to what those first principles are about electoral systems, and one of those will have to deal with the vast size of our province, the geography, the many different communities, different kind of economies we have in the province. So where do you see PR fitting in with the concern that some have about how does the rural-urban divide or distinctions, and how to make sure that regional differences are ably or properly addressed in a reform?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and you know, one is we can look to systems that exist already that have a similar kind of geography. And so Denmark is an example. They have a similar population, 5 million people, and they have the difference between the rural and the urban.
Right.
And so they have the kind of mix of rural-urban system that makes sure that those regional issues are addressed. I know that the Attorney General in his report really made it clear that this was an issue that he wanted to make sure was addressed, and the three systems do touch on that. What I think is really important to note is that currently there is a diversity of voices across BC. Every community has diverse voices. There's no one community that only thinks in a certain. But all of our communities are actually bound together by the shared values that really make up BC. And I've made a point of traveling across BC to as many communities as I can in the last several years. We all want essentially the same things. We want good outcomes for our children. We want an environment that is safe and reliable and we can rely on for clean air, clean water, good food. We want prosperity. We want connection in our community. And so these are the values that actually connect everybody in BC. And the other thing about BC is we all really love this place. I mean, you go to any community and they talk about, this is the best community in BC.
Right.
And I think for everyone who lives in a community and is connected, their community is the best community in BC. And so we can recognize that there's not a big fear that should be informing this. We should actually be excited that those diversity of voices within those shared values can be better represented by our electoral system.
Well, could you just maybe explain to our listeners something I've noted? All three options do still involve some first past the post in them. We often hear that people are talking about scrapping first past the post, or replacing it, or throwing it out, or moving to something completely different. But when you look at the three options that are being presented, each one of them still contains, so in a way it speaks to what you're just talking about, people's pride in their local communities, people's sense of place. And so just invite you to maybe speak to that, because that really does seem to be a worry that some people have that seems to be being misrepresented or misunderstood. And
yeah, they are all a mix, and so the ballots will look fairly familiar in that one part of the ballot is going to be, you know, do you want to vote for this specific representative, just like we do right now. And so there will be, so let's take mixed member proportional, where you will elect a representative under the regular first past the post system, and then you're given a choice to choose one more from any party you want. And that second part allows for regional representation that brings proportionality into the House. So it means that you'll have an MLA in your riding and also a few more regional representatives who will make sure that our House reflects the voting. And this is great because ideally we'll have regions that have members from 2 or 3 parties, which means that if you are, you know, a dyed-in-the-wool, true blue NDP person and you don't feel comfortable going into a Liberal MLA's office, you'll have an NDP office to go into, or vice versa. And this is one of the real challenges we have right now with these giant blocks of the province being represented only by one party or another, is that in those areas, up to 50% of people didn't vote for the MLAs that are representing those areas, and they don't really feel that they have a voice.
Yeah, in many ways, the traditional first past the post system exaggerates regionalism and presents them as homogeneous or more kind of distinct. You know, it highlights the common, you know, rather than the shared values.
Absolutely, and it actually polarizes with this kind of partisan vision. And yet, the thing is, we actually share an enormous amount of shared values and shared vision and goals. And so, we want to be working on that element as opposed to the things that separate us and divide us.
Now, no matter what system of proportional representation, if it does go forward and we get a proportional system, there will likely be minority governments. And this will involve some kind of agreement between two or maybe even more political parties coming together. And this could be on an issue-by-issue basis. It could be a confidence in supply agreement like the one between your party and the NDP caucus, or it could be a more formal coalition. Yeah. When you have these kind of agreements and coalitions, how do citizens know who's making the decisions, and how do they know who to hold accountable when it comes to government inaction or action?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to just start with minority governments and what I see as a huge benefit of minority governments. When we look at some of the policies in Canada that we are most proud of, they came under a minority government. Medicare, Canada Pension Plan, Canada Student Loans, the 40-hour work week, weekends, labor laws, the Equity Marriage Act, the Health Accord. These are just some of the policies that have come in federally under minority governments, because in my view, and you can look at the countries that operate under proportional representation that have a lot of minority governments, is that it focuses on the shared values. It makes the decision making often a much longer horizon that we're looking at, because it's an opportunity for two parties to step out of the election cycle time frame and to look at the longer term, the legacy time frame. What do we want to create together? What will be the legacy of this government? And you know, we see it here in BC. So in the first session in the fall, we banned big money from politics, which was a long overdue piece of policy that needed to happen. We brought in the legislation to enable this referendum, which is you know, such an exciting development. There have been a lot of, there's been, I think the year of politics in BC, for me, is summarized by, at the beginning, talking to Rob Shaw, and he says, I just don't understand how this can work. How can two parties work together? And I kept saying, well, in every realm, adults work together, right? In every other realm, we expect people to be able to work together, and that's what we're going to do here. He says, no, can't be done. A year later, you know, I hear Rob Shaw on CBC last week saying, well, they seem to work together. I mean, they seem to be doing it, and they don't agree on everything, and it involves push and pull, and nobody's always happy with every decision. But those values, that commitment to serving citizens of BC and future generations, underpins the work that we do together.
You mentioned a little bit about decisions taking a bit longer. There have been examples around the world of kind of long delays when it comes to proportional systems. What is your response to people who have that concern?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the work of government always continues. It's not that government shuts down while parties are deciding how to formulate a coalition or a confidence in supply agreement. And when you look at in many ways, even if there are more governments formed, there are actually often fewer elections in proportional representation systems. So Canada has one of the highest sort of number of elections over time, even though we're in a first-past-the-post system. In a proportional system, you can make an agreement between parties. If that doesn't work out, a new agreement can be reached without going back to an election. So it can actually save money. The other thing it does is because it's more based on consensus building, it means that we don't get what we see in Canada and BC, which are these policy lurches. So you get one party that's in power for a long time, and it moves down an avenue of a certain kind of policy. They get finally, you know, thrown out, as we just saw in Ontario, and you get a party that comes in and says, we're going to undo everything they did and we're going to do things completely differently. This actually creates economic uncertainty, social uncertainty. It creates worries and concerns for people who are depending on understanding how the system is going to work. Proportionality actually brings less of that lurching from one side to the other, more consistent policies, stronger economic certainty, long-term social certainty. So in essence, by making it so that parties have to work together, we create a more stable landscape.
Well, we now are officially into the campaign as of July 1st, and Elections BC will be playing a role in that. I think our viewers would be interested in how your party, the BC Greens, your campaign and how it will articulate with, we know there'll be some proponents and then the opponents of this, the no and the yes side.
Yeah.
So where's the Green Party going to be working with, say, the yes side campaign?
Yeah.
There's going to be a network of organizations there. I'm sure the party wants to be seen distinct in one way, but in a sense it'll want to work with like-minded groups. So can you just speak a bit about that?
Absolutely, and so we're still working out all the kinds of details between the different groups and the parties. But for example, I've already been on a panel that had, a Liberal MLA, Bill Teoman, Bruce Halsor, and myself, and so there were 2 pro and 2 against.
Right.
And that was a panel that allowed that kind of dialogue back and forth. Last weekend I was on a panel with Minister George Heyman in his riding as someone from Fair Vote Canada, and Lindsay Post from Lead Now. So I expect that there'll be a lot of that kind of coming together, providing opportunities for people to be able to ask questions directly, to be able to work through the details, and have these kinds of conversations. And as you say, we will want a distinct voice, but a distinct voice that is clearly willing to work with everybody on this, because this is such an important piece of, improving our democracy. I sort of put it as, let's vote better.
Yeah.
We could vote so much better than we do right now. And when I talked to my brother who lives in Ottawa after the election last week, and he described going into the polling booth, and he said, well, my first choice, I wasn't going to vote for because I knew there was no chance he would get elected. My second choice, I wasn't going to vote for because I didn't think she would get elected. I didn't really want to vote for the candidate I voted for, but I did it to stop the candidate I didn't want to get in. And this is the last thing we want in a democracy, is people walking out of a polling booth saying, "Ugh, I can't believe that's what I did."
Yeah. Rather uninspired, strategic voting, very defensive or reactive.
Very, right? Yeah. And what we want, we want people coming out of their polling booth and just feeling empowered and excited and knowing that they are going to be represented, their views and their visions are going to be represented with the candidate or the party that comes closest to that.
Yeah. So I guess one of the benefits we anticipate would be a rise in interest in voting turnout again, perhaps over the coming years. So what about your party's relationship with the NDP in this campaign? Again, both parties have, through the confidence supply agreement, committed to the referendum.
Yeah.
Both going to be in favor of PR of one form or another. So how's that delicate dance going to play out over the coming months?
As I said, so Minister Heyman asked me if I'd come to his riding and be on the panel. Absolutely, I'm happy to be on anybody's panel and to talk about this. I'm so passionate and I really am excited about this. It's not that delicate of a dance, really. It's just people wanting to work together. Right. And I know that the portrayal of politics is often a conflict-driven portrayal, and that's what we've always understood politics to be. I think we can govern better. Right. I think we can do politics better. I really do, and I think we've made some steps towards that. We can make a lot more steps. I truly believe if everybody comes to the table with the best intentions and the greatest desire to serve their constituents as well as all of BC and future generations, we can make awesome decisions that will really help us move towards a shared vision that we have for this province.
Yeah. A few months ago, the Premier said, there's plenty of time to talk about this. In fact, most people, he felt during the summer were going to be just barbecuing and enjoying holidays. But what are your plans? I'm hearing a lot of passion here, but as an MLA and someone who sees this as a monumental historic opportunity, I have a sense that you're going to be kind of busy this summer on this campaign. And can you tell us a bit more about your plans for
I mean, they're still shaping up, those plans, and but I am already quite busy. I've got a lot of speaking engagements. We'll be doing town halls in my own riding in Cowichan. There's a PR event panel up there on June 20th. Right. And those invitations keep coming in, and I keep saying yes because this really matters. And I actually want to talk a little bit about why it matters. When I was 10, I went on a trip to Germany, West Germany, with my father. Mm-hmm. He had been born in East Germany. And there was a conference in Leipzig, East Germany. So it's 1980. And we went to that conference in Leipzig. So I went behind the Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War as a 10-year-old Canadian-born girl with this concept that the whole world was kind of like Canada, right? And that experience, so being followed everywhere we went, tanks driving down the roads, the young men with the guns and the German shepherds that went under the trains to make sure nobody was hanging onto the bottom of the train trying to escape, and just really understanding that notion of like not being allowed to leave, not being allowed to express opinions, not being allowed to say what you really believed, has deeply informed my passion for democracy. And then that has been reinforced by my studies as a historian and then teaching 20th century history and looking at the way that democracy really flourished and came into its own in the 20th century, but seeing erosion of that happening. And I think there's no shortage of examples of that kind of erosion. And the need that we really must embrace in a democracy to recognize that it's actually our responsibility as every citizen to protect it, to nourish it, to help it to evolve, to meet the current situation and context, and to really recognize it as a gift that can be taken away. And having seen the opposite of democracy, I never want that to be a possibility. And so this is why it matters so much.
Drives so much, yeah.
Yeah.
On this topic of protecting democracy, some critics of proportional representation have the concern that under these systems, smaller parties, fringe parties, or even extremist parties might have a disproportionate amount of power. How would you respond to those kind of concerns?
Yeah, well, I would say that we have some fairly fringe politics happening right now under first past the post south of us. Your electoral system is not the driving force of whether you get extremist views or fringe parties emerging. The single greatest in terms of historically, and I used to teach this to my students, a factor in the rise of extremist thinking is inequality. And when you look at inequality and also the lack of capacity for social movement in countries, it's the US and the UK are at the very top of that spectrum in terms of it's getting harder and harder for social movement to happen within those countries. We and the US and the UK are really the last three major holdouts in first past the post in a world where 85% of OECD countries operate under proportional representation. And so in those countries, what you see is more women elected to parliament, you see more diversity, you see higher markers in terms of voter turnout, in terms of participation in democracy. We, as I said earlier, our shared values in BC are really what are going to be the driving force of politics under a proportional system. The polarization under a first past the post, which pushes parties to try to identify themselves more and more by what their differences are, that is actually more worrying to me than minority governments and proportional systems where we start to work on our shared values. One small example out of New Zealand where there was an anti-immigration party, and when they were engaged in conversation, and they got a small number of votes and a small number of seats, and they don't become a driving force of policy, but when they were engaged in conversations about why do you hold these views, why are you afraid of immigration, the reality was that it was rooted in the fact that they were afraid of the loss of jobs for New Zealanders. And when policies were brought in that addressed those fears, then those extremist views dissipated. And they started to realize that immigration was not the driving cause of the lack of jobs, that we have policies that can ensure that we can address those problems. So in some ways, making these views part of a participatory democracy, but I'm not worried about extremist views in BC. And the final thing that's really important is there's a 5% threshold that was introduced with the recommendations, which would mean that no party would get seats with less than 5% of the vote. What I do like about the systems that have been brought in is that because there's the first past the post,
Right.
independents can be elected.
Yes.
So somebody like Vicky Huntington, who was a very popular representative for her riding, under this kind of these systems being proposed, she would still very much have the chance to be elected.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important piece to remember. But in terms of extremism exists under first past the post, and this is not a harbinger of that kind of thing. We actually, it creates far more consensus and shared values.
And if you are successful, if the Yes campaign is successful and we move to proportional system, what is the post-referendum process going to look like? Do you have any concerns about it?
Yeah. So the post-referendum, there's really two major pieces of that. One is that there will be an all-party legislative committee, which will hold committee meetings, which will be public. They will invite experts, and they will sort of fill in the final details of the system, whichever system is chosen by the electorate. The second piece is the Electoral Boundaries Commission, which will determine, as they do after every second election in BC anyways, the Electoral Boundaries Commission will determine the boundaries of the ridings as determined by the system that's been chosen. I think this is a great post-referendum process. I think it's very exciting to have that conversation ongoing. And then finally, the recommendations would go back to the legislature and they would be voted on there.
I'm sorry we're out of time. I'm sure we could talk a lot more, but Laurel Collins and myself, Michael Prince, thank you, Sonia Furstenau, for joining us today on Electoral Referendums 2018. Are you voting for change? Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another segment of Voting for Change. My name is Jake Harrigan. I'm here with my co-host, Fernando Garci-Crespo. Tonight, we are in the wake of an announcement and the recommendation of the Attorney General, David Eby. He has made a large announcement regarding the future of what's going to be happening with the referendum. So today, we have with us a special guest, Fraser Byers. Fraser.
Hey, Jake.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, I'm really good.
Good, good. Fraser is the director of Youth for PR. He's a proponent group for electoral reform going forward. Fraser, it's fantastic to have you on the show right now.
So good to be here. Thanks,
All
Jake.
right. So going forward with the referendum, well, I want to know from somebody who is embroiled in it. You are out there trying to educate people, trying to talk to people. What is it from your perspective? What is it about proportional representation that makes it better for Canadians than the system that they currently have right now?
Okay, yeah, well, really, proportional representation, it's pretty simple. And when it comes to elections are all about, making sure that the voice of the voters is represented in government. So with first past the post right now, we have governments that only, 40% of the voters voted for, and they have 100% of the power. That really doesn't make sense. So with PR, proportional representation, you get coalitions, you get governments that actually represent what the voters voted for. So, whether, basically the whole basis of PR is that if a party got 40% of the vote, they get 40% of the seats.
Okay,
so it's
that makes a lot
simple.
of sense.
Yeah.
But for some reason, that's not what we have going on right now. We could just look, for example, at what's going on in Ontario.
Yeah,
with the
exactly.
Ford government. That government, 40% of the vote, but there they are with the majority and all of the power. That doesn't quite seem right.
Not at all.
So a proportional representation system, that's going to do something to help that?
Oh, definitely. And proportional representation, it doesn't just bring this fairness to governance. It also brings all these other great features, all these other great outcomes in elections, such as a way higher representation of women and minorities, a much higher youth turnout, 12% in countries that have proportional representation. So it's really great, and what we've seen across the world in countries that have it, it works for the electorate, and it actually represents what the people want. So I see no bad thing about it.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of different flavors of PR, and we won't get into the weeds right now about it. But it's good to know that you are optimistic about broadly what PR can bring to Canadians. So thank you.
Sure.
Well, as the director of Youth for PR, and I'm not anymore as Jake would say, the wonder child in the room, and why do you think it's such an important issue for youth like you and I, and maybe Jake? I don't know if we consider you youth anymore. And why do you think it's important? Have you had a positive response from people our age on the issue, or has it followed, you know, the typical trend of young people not being very engaged? Why?
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, unlike normal elections, you know, these referendums on electoral reform, the outcome will last for centuries rather than just 4 years. So really, when we look at the outcomes, it's going to matter a lot more to young people like us than older generations. So that's why it's important to youth, and that's one of the main reasons why we created Youth for PR. Many of the things that we're doing with Youth for PR is engage. You know, the main goal is to engage youth, and the ways we're doing that is through online social media. We're inside campuses across British Columbia, you know, canvassing for change. We're also doing things with high school teachers. You know, we're creating all these great resources that we can get in the classrooms, and so they can educate the younger students on electoral reform and proportional representation, and even first past the post.
Oh, that's great to hear, because like you said, this isn't something that's just going to come and have an effect in the short term. These students who maybe can't vote right now are going to have to be dealing with the repercussions of this decision going forward.
Exactly.
So it makes sense to try and get them as much in the loop as they can.
Yeah, well, exactly. And you know, we're a non-partisan, you know, organization, and we're not doing this for any party in particular. We're just doing it because we see that this matters a lot to our future. This matters a lot to the future of British Columbia. So I mean, we really care about it, and I think the reaction we've gotten from young voters is that they care about it once they know about it. You know, electoral reform it's not an exciting topic.
Yeah.
You know, there's lots of different you know, systems that we don't want to get in, that we don't want to talk about because they're confusing. But really, once young people understand the benefits of PR, they care about it and they want to work towards it.
Right. Sorry, Fernando, go ahead.
And have you found that youth who were previously unengaged with the topic of politics like the idea of having PR and would be willing to get interested in that once we change?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the ones that we've talked to, they're really into the idea, and even some of them were kind of against it beforehand. But once they learned about it, once they heard about what the great things it's doing in other countries, they understand it and they want to work towards it.
Well, that can be a problem, not just with youth even, but for audiences of all ages, is hearing anything that isn't status quo.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, they say the devil you know is something or other about that. They say something about that. The idea is that the devil you know is less scary than the one you don't.
Yes.
People are much less willing to go out and try something new. But it's important to realize that while we may think of this as new, it's actually been tried all over the world quite a bit. If you look at a lot of European countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even a lot of Commonwealth countries just like Canada. Look at New Zealand.
Yeah.
New Zealand uses a PR system, and New Zealand also changed to a PR system. It didn't always start out that way.
No.
They went through a number of referendums just like we did here in BC. When did they start? 1993 was the last one where they switched?
Yes, and actually the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who was the leader of the Labour Party at the time, Helen Clark, she was dead set against it during the referendum, and now she's coming on a tour to British Columbia to promote the proportional representation. So it really shows that even people who are against it, once they realize that as a politician you're not going to get yelled at on the screen because people need to form coalitions with you, it really changes people's minds. So I find it very exciting.
There is a definite shift in the dynamics in the countries where you see PR in place. A lot more collaboration, a lot more cross-partisan work.
Yep.
And for me, from my perspective, that really brings forward the best in the middle grounds that people share, the values that are shared by the people.
Yeah.
And so when I think about proportional representation, I don't think about being the parties. It's not about the parties, it's about the people, and bringing forward what the people really want.
Exactly. I mean, proportional representation, it works for everybody. And you know, when people understand that their vote will always matter with PR, it's huge, because I think, you know, as we've heard in the last elections, over 50% of people, their votes didn't matter. And that really frustrates people, and it would frustrate me if I was able to vote. So yeah, you know, if my vote didn't matter, you know, I would hate that. So people hearing that and, you know, learn about that, that's a big point for them.
Can you elaborate a little bit, just for the people at home, what you mean by your vote not mattering?
Yeah, totally. So basically, with first past the post, you know, we're all divided into different constituencies, and you all vote for your constituent, and And basically, okay, so how it works, you know, there's one of the people running in your constituency, they will win, right? But they will only win with, I don't know, perhaps 40% of the vote in that constituency.
Right. They don't need 50% of the vote to win.
Exactly. So then there's 60% of the people in that constituency that haven't actually elected anybody, and their vote really hasn't gone anywhere.
Right.
So then when you have all these different people who haven't gotten what they wanted in all these constituencies, that number put together is...
It tends to skew the results overall.
Yeah, so that's kind of where that number comes from.
Right. So you can think about it. If you're a purple voter in a brown district, your vote doesn't count. You don't get to elect someone who represents your values or your beliefs, and that's what you're trying to change with PR. You're trying to have your vote impact even if you're in that situation.
Yeah, and it's even a large effect if you're a you know, a brown voter in a constituency where it's always been purple, right? If 90% of the people there vote purple, then your vote will never matter, and people get really you know, frustrated with that, and that actually stops them from voting in the future because they never see the point in voting.
Yeah, well, exactly. People get disillusioned with the system because they don't think it's working for them. When you can see when we talk about it right now that in a lot of cases for these people, it's not working for them genuinely. People talk a lot about that with regards to youth. People say youth are not engaged, they don't want to come out and vote. And yet now when we talk about it in our current political climate, you can kind of see some of the reasons why. Does that resonate with you? Maybe part of the reason that younger people aren't coming out and engaging with politics as much as maybe because they don't feel like they're being represented?
Yeah, that's totally the reason. I mean, yeah, people aren't being represented, and when they don't see you know, any possibility for them to be represented, they're not as likely to be engaged, not unlikely to vote. So you know, when we have in countries like Canada where the percentage of people voting is going really down, is going vastly down, it's huge for us to have the chance to bring in a system of PR, because as we've seen across the world, it increases voter turnout, especially among youth.
Wow. Yeah, that's some powerful stuff.
Sure.
So one thing that I did want to talk about with you and for the people at home is that in the announcement that just came out, it was a week old, and if you haven't had the chance to read all 104 pages yet, I don't blame you, but there's a couple key points that I think people should know. A couple questions that do come up quite a bit that I do want to speak to, and that's the referendum is finally been given a date. It's going to be happening between late October and November, and it's still going to be a mail-in ballot. So we can talk about that in a bit. I know you have some concerns about what that might mean for youth, but what we do know is that the question is going to come in two parts, which a lot of people are very happy about on both sides of the issue. The two parts are going to be, are you for a PR voting system or against it? And then the second bit is, if you're for it, they'll ask you to rank one of three choices. And we won't get too into that today. We don't have time to go in depth on all of the three choices. They are dual member proportional, mixed member proportional, and urban-rural PR. That for another time. But you have the chance to actually rank them if you are in favor. And if you're not in favor, you just say no, and that's the end of it for you on your ballot. So that's something that a lot of people are really excited about because it gives them the chance to express themselves one way or another. The other thing that came out in the announcement is that they are adding a max of 8 new members of legislature to the ridings in all of BC. A lot of people were concerned that this referendum was going to balloon Parliament, that it was going to get out of control. The Attorney General Ebby said no, maximum of 8, and if you've gone way in depth and read the report like I may have late that night, you'll know that it's not even a sure thing that we're going to have 8 new. It could be less. It could be even less than that.
Likely, yeah. So I mean, actually, I wanted to perhaps correct you one bit. Even if you do vote no against PR, you still will have the chance to pick which one would be better.
So you can still have your voice heard.
Well,
that's
exactly.
fantastic.
Which it's great, yeah. Because I mean, even if you're against originally having PR, you still have the chance to vote for which one you think is best. And if it wasn't like that, we would be against people not having that chance. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
I completely agree. I think it was an awesome idea. I wasn't gonna correct you, but I don't want to. No, I have respect for my
Thank you very much. I'm really out of my element here in this Youth for PR discussion. No, but it is very important, and the idea was to conduct the referendum in as proportionate a way as possible.
Yep.
So making sure that people's voices are heard, absolutely number one. So thank you for that. So we were talking about the mail-in ballot
Yes.
that is going to be such a key player. You said earlier that you were concerned because youth, and we're talking about mostly university students and young adults who are on the move, might have a hard time actually getting these ballots.
Exactly, and with most university students, they might not actually have an address. So with the or whatever. So with the mail-in ballot, they might not actually get that at their doorstep. So it's going to be our campaign. One of the things we're going to be most working towards is to make it as accessible as possible for these students, these younger people, to vote in this referendum. Because there's no point in trying to in terms of getting the yes vote, there's no point in educating these people. There's no point in telling them to vote yes if there's no possible way they can vote yes. And we don't want them to have to sign up online for a mail-in ballot to come and then they have to fill it out and mail it back. That's too much, and university students have a lot going on. So that's one of the things we're going to be working with, and perhaps talking with the government and see what ways we can make it more accessible for youth.
Right, you're going to be involved in hopefully some kind of
process.
process.
Yeah, exactly. We'll find that out. We'll have more to say later on about
that.
Okay,
that's fair. Well, it's good. You've got a whole summer before you're going to be ramping up in the fall with all of this going on.
Yes. And do you plan on having polls in the universities, or how do you think it could work?
We won't be running any polls within the university. We're kind of be more focused on. Do you mean ballot, like having stations there? We'll see. We don't know yet.
It's all a process.
Yeah.
So making sure that it's done in a responsible way for the youth.
Exactly.
If you want to engage with young people, government is going to absolutely have to make the effort.
Yeah,
there's
for
no
sure.
doubt about
Exactly, and I think they understand that it's going to be impacting these people a lot more than the older voters. So hopefully they try an effort to make it easy for these people to vote.
Definitely.
And one question that I had particularly is, on local representation and better representation of everyone. Do you think that having a proportional system would help young people get elected the same way as it would do with minorities and women?
Well, for sure, yeah, and that's part of that I actually forgot to mention. With proportional representation, as we've seen in other countries, it's a lot easier for these younger people to get elected. And yes, so certainly that could happen in British Columbia in these ridings. And another point is that the three options that they're presented of proportional systems, they all keep the local representation.
Okay, perfect.
Well, that's important.
It is good, yeah.
Because that's a major concern for people.
Yes.
I mean,
particularly in the interior like you,
Well, a lot of people don't know that about me. I'm from the interior. I'm from a fairly rural riding. But when I talk to my family back home, they're all saying, well, we're worried that something's going to happen. We're going to lose our representative. Maybe it'll go somewhere else. The votes will be taken, to a bigger city. Or what do you have to say about that?
I don't think they should worry about it, because and when people are saying will my votes go somewhere else, well, the whole point of proportional representation is to make your voice be heard. So these people maybe in the urban ridings or anywhere, they should really relax about that issue, because actually with PR their votes are going to be heard and they will actually have an impact on the election outcome no matter what happens in their local riding.
Well, and even polling shows that the interior and rural areas are more for PR than the urban areas.
Wow.
Particularly because if I live in a district in Vancouver, let's say Vancouver Quad or Vancouver Point Grey, and I'm represented by David Eby in Vancouver Point Grey, and suddenly I'm a BC Liberal, I can go to the riding next door and have someone who understands my same concerns and who lives a similar life to me, who is a BC Liberal, and he or she will understand exactly what I'm going through. Yeah. But if I'm a person living in the interior, in the middle of Nelson Crescent, the riding,
you can't just make that walk down the street.
Exactly, you cannot just make that walk down the street.
Your representation is important to you, as you know. So I think that's something that a lot of people can take to heart, is that they don't need to be afraid of losing their representation.
Yeah. And another great thing with PR is if well, you hear about, that governments really only do stuff in swing ridings to make sure that they can get that vote. But with proportional representation, because it's not necessarily dependent on what happens in that riding, they'll actually be campaigning everywhere, and once they're in government, they'll be doing things in every part of the province. So it's not all about actually what happens in the election, but actually after the election, when this government is in office, they'll be doing great things. They have potential to do things across the province, because they're trying to get the votes everywhere, not just in these certain ridings where they think that their voters are, or in the swing ridings where they want to gain new ones.
Yeah, like Vancouver Island, whenever there's a government that is BC Liberals, sometimes we get neglected, and whenever there's a NDP government, some places in the interior get neglected. So it's important to see that all sides are heard,
Exactly.
and youth are represented. Like we know in Australia, there's a senator that is less than 25 years old, who's in a wheelchair, who got elected by PR. And if you cannot physically be campaigning in your riding, then it also allows for people to do it through social media and to find other ways to do it. The same way in New Zealand, there's a woman, an MP who's 22 years old and who lost a nomination for her riding for an older, more mature person. And then she ran on the party list and actually got higher than that woman and got represented because young people wanted to have a young person representing them. And that just works better.
Right. It's just better representation is what you're saying. There's more, it sounds like accountability.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's not just accountability during the election cycle, but continual accountability.
Exactly.
Because you are at risk of losing some of these rights.
And because it is collaborative governance, there's always that accountability when these parties are in office. Because, with proportional representation, because there are these collaborative coalition governments, they will always hold each other to make sure they stick to their promises rather than just telling people one thing and doing another when they're part of government.
No, absolutely. And especially when people don't have to sort of vote down a line in their riding, when there's really a chance for change, parties really have to respect their word.
Yes, exactly.
And particularly for young people like all the three of us, enough joking.
I like that you brought me into this finally, Fernando.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, you're a young person too. It's important that we see, policies being thrown that are going to last more than 4 years. Because if we get governments that are just trying to get reelected because they don't have to be accountable to anyone, because they're a majority, they're less likely to act on climate change, and they're less likely to act on things like debt and being fiscally responsible, because you're just trying to get reelected. So you just hide the expenditures under the rug and things like that. So when we are in 20 years from now, we will be paying the price for unaccountable government that doesn't put long-term policy through, and we will have climate change and we'll have debt. And we really need to have someone, I don't know if you agree, or do you think that proportional representation will bring governments that will plan more for the future and more for our generation?
For sure, yeah, no, it's true, and exactly what you said. Proportional representation, with these governments that it'll create, it will allow for much longer term planning, because it's more likely, well, basically the parties won't be having to just do stuff to get voters in the next election. And these collaborative governments, they'll be working with each other more often and in most, after most elections. So it really does allow for that. And as we've seen in other countries, the ones with PR, they have done a lot more action in stuff such as climate change. So it is really good. And if people worry about, and especially for youth, when we worry about what's going to be for our future, what's going to happen then, PR is great for that, because it's all about the long-term planning and making sure that everything is great for the future.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. With regards to that, I wanted to add that yes, definitely all around the world, you see countries, OECD countries, and they are performing better in PR systems in terms of environmental outcomes, and surprisingly to some, in terms of financial outcomes, because they plan for stability rather than short-term gain.
Yes.
So it's a very different shift in perspective. It's a different lens that you get to look through the political landscape at.
And markets can predict, and enterprises can predict that when a policy that is popular with the people gets passed, then it will remain there. Because even in places like the United States, where they have first past the post, even if 85% of people support gun control because of the system, the way it works, and it just concentrates power, it won't get done. Whereas if you go to countries that have proportional representation, if a good idea gets taken that has support from the people, the kingmakers or the people holding the balance in power will not side with a party that goes against that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and it's much more.
Yeah,
much
and
more
like in
positive.
Canada, you know, we've seen that we've had these majority governments, and
Yeah.
you know, people think that these majority governments, they do lots of things and they perhaps do more than minorities, but really what happens is they do stuff, but then the next majority comes in from a different party and they
Exactly.
take it all away.
They undo it.
So yeah, exactly. So there is really no progression, and with proportional representation, because these parties are working more with each other, it actually allows for these policies to be made and these policies to be kept.
Well, it's an interesting stigma to address in the Canadian context,
Yeah.
the idea that minority governments somehow get less
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
But we look at BC right now. Horgan has a ridiculously high popularity rating, and if you
Yes.
look at some of the things that you think of as quintessentially Canadian, universal health care, passed under a minority government.
Yes.
Exactly.
So
And-
I don't think there's anything to worry about when it comes to that.
And if everyone, you know, thinks of Canadians as kind and compassionate, and as a foreigner, I completely can attest to that.
Yeah.
And it is. Why is the legislature everyone yelling at each other? Like it should
Yeah.
be. The government should
Like-
represent people. That is the basis of democracy.
Exactly. Yeah,
And if the people are yelling at each other in
Politics,
government,
the
yeah.
politics are not reflective of the
No.
people.
No, not at all.
Of the people that constituted. And I think that is what you're saying is going to be a problem that is at least maybe not solved completely, but is going to be smoothed out by proportional.
No, it is incredible that we have, you know, these grown men, grown women and men in Parliament, and they're yelling at each other while, you know, we're at school being told to be polite,
Exactly.
you know, just not bully each other, and then we look up to these people who should be our role models, and we see that. So yeah, I mean that's you know what first past the post really is, to be honest.
Just a big yelling fight.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you very much for coming as a guest. It was a great pleasure having you. I think we can both agree, young and maybe young, we can both agree it's great to have young people like you that inspire us to continue taking action.
Yeah, well, thank you so
on
much. This was
on
a lot
very
of fun.
important
Yeah.
Fraser. All right.
Well, since we taped that show with Sonia Furstenau, there's been an interesting development here in BC on the legal front regarding the actual future or validity of the referendum. The Independent Contractors and Business Association of BC, a group that represents over 2,300 companies here in the province, joined by a few other parties, have submitted a legal claim to the BC Supreme Court calling into question the very regulations upon which the referendum campaign and the funding for groups and the very questions themselves on the mail-in ballot are being put into question on some legal grounds. The questions are, first of all, are the regulations that were passed by Cabinet back in June, are they consistent with the actual objectives and purpose of the legislation? That's the Electoral Reform Referendum Act of 2018. That was passed last fall in the legislature by the NDP and Green support. That allows the referendum to be carried out this year, as we know. The regulations actually then provided the details as to what the questions would be, what kind of length of the campaign, the rules regarding advertising, spending limits, and how much groups could spend on the campaign. Some of the arguments that are being put forth to the court to consider are that the regulations are not consistent with the actual purpose of the legislation. The claimants are arguing that the ballot questions are not really a clear expression of the purpose of the act, that they're not going to provide voters with a clear enough and distinct enough sense of what the questions are, and that a majority of voters will not really be in full understanding of what the implications are of voting yes to PR and choosing one or more and ranking one or more of the options on the ballot. Some of the other arguments are even more provocative, are that the regulations are inconsistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In other words, the claims being made that the regulations are unconstitutional, contravening fundamental laws of the country. The arguments there are quite interesting. I won't get into all the details, but they concern, first of all, are the rules under the regulations regarding spending limits for third-party organizations and for the opponent and proponent groups that are each being given $500,000 for the 5-month campaign, and then there are $200,000 limits for third-party groups. Are these unduly restrictive or too tight for groups to be able to actually convey in that time period the information on the options, the pros and the cons? The arguments by these claimants to the Supreme Court of BC is that this isn't enough time and that the spending limits are too restrictive and offend Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights on freedom of expression. They're also arguing that the rules are a restriction on freedom of association, that these third-party groups cannot work more closely with political parties in the province, and arguing also that the rules are so complicated in registering and having to contact the electoral chief officer of the province around having staff and a lawyer and an auditor and an accountant, that these are undue, excessive red tape that actually is going to frustrate groups to be able to freely associate and freely express themselves during the campaign. These are not frivolous claims or arguments. The question, though, is now that we're underway in the campaign, is when the court would actually hear this rather serious set of charges or claims against the actual foundations of the referendum. What the group's asking for, that's put forward this claim, is to have the cabinet decision quashed. In other words, that the regulations be ruled void and null. Also then telling the chief electoral officer to not move forward in carrying out the implementation of the referendum regulations, so that they would not be getting any public information. Basically hitting the pause button on the referendum. I think that's a rather dramatic scenario. What we might see, though, is a debate or a clash of arguments between government lawyers and lawyers representing these interest groups who want to question the very foundation of the referendum, its process, the funding restrictions, and the questions themselves. And for those who thought that the summer was going to be a quiet time when not much was going to be heard about proportional representation or the campaign or the ballot question, well, this legal challenge is, I think, guaranteed that this should become a major focus of interest and debate in this province over the coming weeks and months. So this is fundamental to the referendum, and we will keep you appraised in coming shows as to how this plays out. Thank you very much.